On Wednesday, China unveiled a list of U.S. imports worth some $50 billion that will be subject to up to 25% of tariffs, including soybeans, automobiles, and chemical products. The list was in response to a list the Trump administration released just hours earlier of Chinese imports that will be subject to higher tariffs. The Chinese side did not specify when the list will go into effect, although it is likely to depend on when the U.S. government imposes its tariffs on Chinese products. China has also formally filed a formal complaint with the World Trade Organization about the U.S.'s conduct. So what is behind this latest round of tit-for-tat tariffs, and how much of this is brinksmanship in the run-up to possible direct negotiations that could still prevent a trade conflict from spinning out of control? Welcome to a special edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin. Joining me here in the Beijing studio is Zhao Hai from the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. In America, we have Professor Christopher Chambers from Georgetown University. From Philadelphia, we're joined by Blackburn-Dwyer, founder of Grasshopper Strategies, and in New York, Professor Ian Reifowitz of SUNY-Empire State College. Gentlemen, welcome to this show. According to the U.S. Trade Representative, the total value of imports subject to tariff increase will be some 500 billion U.S. dollars. And as I said, China has formally launched its complaint, or China has formally sued the United States to the World Trade Organization. Professor Chambers, let me come to you first. How do you think of China's action by coming up with this list and immediately suing the United States at the World Trade Organization?
Well, it's to be expected. I mean, when any nation's faced with a direct threat in terms of tariffs, the response is going to have to be strong. Of course, there will be behind-the-scenes negotiations for, with the contacts between the two nations bilaterally to try to work things out. But however, when you have such a provocative action by one country, the other country is going to respond. I think that from the United States point of view, President Trump had been promising basically to do something like this to his base in the Republican Party while he was running for president, and now that is what what motivates him, whether it's a ruinous trade war or not. He's motivated by keeping that base happy, so that's what he's doing. So this is, just the next expected step, and our stock market is responding accordingly.
Mr. Blackburn-Dwyer, China has cited the reason for bringing the U.S. to the WTO trade dispute settlement mechanism, saying the United States purposely violated the core principle of the WTO, which is most favored nation status and tariff restrictions, and is a typical unilateralism and protectionist measure. What do you think of China's rationale behind bringing the U.S. in front of the WTO court?
It's perfectly reasonable that China wants to bring the United States to the WTO court. This is exactly what the United States has done against China and other countries in the past. Anytime one country comes up with a new justification for tariffs, the WTO is supposed to be the venue we go to discuss this for. So it's not surprising. It's frankly incredibly appropriate. It's also interesting to see China bringing a country to the WTO over tariffs when other countries have done that to China in the past. So in my opinion, it's a positive sign that China and many other countries are hopefully engaging with these multilateral institutions. But the problem is, the United States is using, for the steel and aluminum, the national security exception, which is always very difficult to overcome at the WTO. And now they're basically saying that these new rounds of tariffs are about IP theft, another item that's going to be very difficult to prove or disprove at the WTO level. The reality is the WTO is going to be a pressure point, simply similar to how both sides' lists at the moment are pressure points. It's important to remember that neither side has enacted any of the tariffs relating to these 50 billion numbers. What they have done is announce lists that are 2 to 3 to 4 months away from possibly happening, laying the groundwork for intense bilateral negotiations.
Professor Reifowitz, how do you look at the list that China came up with in just a matter of hours after the United States came up with a list of over 1,300 product lines from China? How do you look at the strength or the measurement of the Chinese response?
Well, it's a strong response. I mean, I don't think they were waiting for the most recent list to come out to start preparing their own list. I'm sure they had one ready to go. They are going to target specific industries and sectors of the economy that they think will hurt the president politically. So, you know, you have things like soybean and pork. Iowa, for example, a key state in the Trump coalition, a state that Barack Obama won twice, that President Trump won in 2016, is heavily dependent on pork, and exporting pork to China is hurting the exports to China is going to hurt the economy of Iowa. So I don't think there's any question that they knew exactly what they were doing. And just to follow on with what my colleague said, I think the real question is whether these tariffs will ever get initiated, or will there be some kind of negotiation during the period between the time that the lists are announced and the time that the tariffs are actually implemented. I think certainly that's what Trump hopes. He hopes to by threatening a trade war, avoid a trade war and resolve some of the issues around intellectual property that are serious issues between the U.S. and China. And I think our question here is whether his actions are the right way to go, or whether he would have been better off taking sort of the high ground and going to the WTO himself. And we can talk about that some more, obviously.
So, Mr. Zhao Hai, coming back to the Chinese rationale, I understand you had some kind of understanding of the process. Tell us about the consideration of China's coming up with a list and the selection of this 106 product lines in response to 1,300 product lines from the United States.
I think our speakers has already pointed out, number one, China's response is very swift. That means China has been preparing for the list for some time now. And the list is very accurate, targeted, in proportion and reciprocal with American list. So that list, also mentioned before, including soybeans, grains, pork, and also remember there's automobiles and airplanes included. So that means not only the agricultural sector of the U.S. will be suffering from the consequences if the trade war starts, but also the manufacturing base will be suffering as well. And also, if you look at the list, the interesting thing is that China can find substitution or alternative sources for this kind of products. For instance, soybeans, China can source that from South America countries like Argentina or Brazil. And also airplane, there's competitors from European countries also available. So I think China's response is very considerable and also in reciprocity, preparing and leaving room for future negotiations with the United States.
What about the complaint China brought up in the World Trade Organization? What kind of message do you think China is trying to send here, Mr. Zhao Hai?
I think China is sending a very clear message to the United States that this is not a simply bilateral matter. It is a global matter. China wanted to maintain an open and free international trading system. And filing complaint of this U.S. tariff in that WTO means that China wants to solve this through multinational mechanism instead of the United States taking a unilateral protectionist measure against China. So I think the aim is very clear to establish some kind of united front globally against Trump administration's unilateral actions.
Professor Chambers, what do you think will be the response from the United States to China's effort to bring some kind of a united front against such kind of unilateral trade practices by the United States? Do you think this would have an effect on the Trump administration to bring them back from a possibly dangerous place?
Well, the administration has been slowly, or in some instances very quickly, getting rid of people in the administration that believe in multilateralism and global kind of global rule of law sorts of regimes, such as the WTO. So it's hard to say what will happen. I think this administration is guided by maybe 50% the political goals that they see, the political advantages that they can derive, and the disadvantages they can heap on their opponents at home, and then 50% of it is a way of creating a bilateral dialogue where they can basically horse trade certain items, and then of course that feeds back into the political aspect where if the president says if I can get the tariffs down on pork, then I'll get Iowa back. If I can throw away some other issue, other product that I don't really care about, then I'll let the Chinese have that. I mean, that is basically his mode of dealing whether you're talking about business or in politics. It's half bluster, half strategy. The question is, where does that get us? So, at this point in Washington, those of us who observe this stuff, we don't really know, because this is new ground. This is his style of dealing with things, and the people who are in the administration that could hold him back or hold him accountable to these multilateral regimes are being fewer and fewer and being winnowed out of the Department of Commerce, about state and other agencies that have expertise in this.
Right. Mr. Blackburn-Dwyer, let me come to you. Do you agree with the kind of motivation behind President Trump's actions? And if so, do you think his way, his style of doing things is going to really get him the kind of results that he wanted, for instance, to reduce U.S.-China trade deficit by $100 billion US?
Quite simply, no. But I also think that my colleague pointed out one of the definitions of winning for President Trump is very different than other presidents. He can set a goal like, I want to reduce the trade deficit by $100 billion. He set that during the campaign. But the reality is he will declare victory if he can take China from their promised 25% tariffs down to a 5% tariff. He'll turn around and he'll say, see, I beat China in this negotiation and got them to lower their tariffs by 20%. Completely ignoring the fact that prior to him starting this particular battle, China would have been lower than the end result anyway. President Trump is driven, I would say, largely by political, but even more so by self-aggrandizement. He is targeting this list at his base. He started with steel and aluminum when he said that the real problem was intellectual property. Steel and aluminum have nothing to do with intellectual property. He's now targeting areas that are a little bit higher technology, but still do not get after any of the intellectual property that his USTR used to justify these. President Trump will declare that he is victorious if he can get China to remove anywhere back from its current hardline stance of 25%. That's very dangerous for trade. That's effectively declaring victory when trade will be harder between the two countries. China has been very smart at the way it's targeted its list. I'll also point out that China, while matching dollar for dollar the amount that the United States is adding or threatening in new tariffs at $50 billion, proportionally that's hugely different. $50 billion is 1/10 what the United States buys from China. $50 billion is 1/3 what China buys from the United States. So China has picked a very brilliant time to get very good at matching math, but ignoring proportionality. Trump, I think, has walked into a much more savvy China than he is expecting.
Zhao Hai, since we're talking about the kind of way of thinking within the Chinese administration, do you agree with Mr. Blackburn-Dwyer when he said that China is playing a very savvy game, dollar for dollar against what the United States, instead of in terms of proportion of the trade to the total volume?
Well, when China looks at this problem, I think there are two layers. One layer is Trump himself. Like our colleagues said just now, that Trump just wants to declare victory. And anything can give him this kind of glory, he will try to grab this and take that credit. However, I think the problem between U.S. and China is deeper than that, and China realized that. And that is, IPR problems, market access problems, and all kinds of industrial policy complaints. So I think beneath it, if you look at the list coming from the U.S. side, U.S. is also calculating how to deal with China and how to have those punitive measures against China. The list does not include the final products, the consumer electronic products, which is a large portion between U.S. and China trade. And they're included mostly machinery, machine tools, and those kind of machines or intermediary goods that coming from China to the United States. So I think both sides are calculating the possibility of negotiations and trying to leave them room for future negotiations. And I think at this point, China will play this smart and will not will stand tough, but at the same time will be willing to start negotiation anytime.
What is China's ultimate message here? What does China want to tell to President Trump, Zhao Hai?
Well, I think China wants to tell Mr. Trump that this trade war will benefit no one and will hurt his own base ultimately, and he will not win from this from any angle. So I think, and also not only China and the U.S., if China and the U.S. enter into a global trade war, other countries will invariably get involved and drag into this.
Okay, Mr. Reifowitz, let me come to you. Okay, President Trump or his administration has carefully avoided consumer products which might hurt the ordinary shoppers. However, wasn't he not aware that soybeans might be on the list of China's response list for the United States? Professor Reifowitz.
Well, look, the president has not shown that his administration has a high level of competence on a lot of detail-oriented things. I can't say that they would accurately predict what kinds of products China would come back with. But honestly, I don't think that they would have changed their strategy if they had known that China would include product X as opposed to product Y. What it comes down to here is they believe, their calculation, I think, is that if they threaten these tariffs, and as has been pointed out, they don't take effect yet. If they threaten the tariffs, that they'll get some movement on the core issue that they see, which is the intellectual property and this problem of technology transfers or voluntary technology transfers. They think that when you make threats, and this is what Trump seems to have learned from his business career, that when you make threats, the other side will give in. Will that happen? We'll have to see. I mean, both sides talk about negotiations. But it's also about the fact that Trump doesn't want to do things the right way or the expected way or the diplomatic way, which would be to bring a case to the WTO. In fact, he even said that the U.S., and the quote was, quote, loses almost all the cases it brings, end quote, to the WTO. That's just not true. The U.S. has actually won 91% of the cases it's brought to the WTO, which is slightly above the average of a complainant's victory rate. So the WTO does work for the United States. So Trump maybe is missing out on the most effective way of winning simply because it doesn't play to his style. And I think that's really the thing I would mostly criticize about Trump's approach here. His goal of opening up markets, of dealing with the intellectual property issue is not a bad goal for a U.S. president to have. It's just a matter of what's the best way of going about doing it that doesn't risk real economic harm, and also just what's the best way of going about winning on the issue at hand, which is this intellectual property issue. I don't think that the threatening tariffs is going to be the right way to go. We'll have to see what happens with the negotiations.
China has said during a joint press conference earlier today between the Ministry of Finance and the Ministry of Commerce that pressure will only become driving force for the Chinese. It will not bring the Chinese people down. You have been watching The Point with me, Liu Xin. We'll take a very quick break, and we'll be back right after this. Stay with us. Welcome back, and let's continue talking about U.S.-China trade frictions. And one of the key words in President Trump's mouth is trade deficit. And again, in the very latest tweet, he talked about U.S.-China having some kind of $500 billion trade deficit. Zhao Hai, I want to come to you. What exactly is the right number? Because we have heard very different numbers, right? And China's number with the U.S. number also very different. What exactly is the size of trade deficit to begin with?
I think there are 2 points I want to make here. Number one, U.S. statistics is very different from China's. According to the latest U.S. statistics last year, the trade deficit stands at $370 billion U.S. dollars. And from the Chinese side, we have about just over 200 billion U.S. dollars. The difference is because there are different methods of calculating the deficit trade, and particularly the transit trade through Hong Kong is part of the difference over here. But number two, I want to talk about is that the nature of this deficit is the problem at hand right here. I think the understanding of Mr. Trump of the trade deficit between two countries is very mercantilistic and also kind of a zero-sum game. So in his idea, U.S. deficit to China is U.S. loss to China. That's a very wrong idea. I think anyone understanding international trade won't take that seriously.
However, he has been repeatedly talking about trade deficit and using that as kind of a ultimate goal to, or the reason why he wants to do whatever he's doing with China. Professor Chambers, what does that say about, again, this kind of policy-making process under the Trump administration? He just brings a number and just uses it and exaggerates and say it in his tweets or in public speeches, whether or not these numbers are correct, Professor Chambers.
Well, that's been his style all along. I mean, that's what attracted a lot of voters to him and still attracts voters to him. I think he and his aides, his close aides, still believe that even if the people in his base in the Republican Party are damaged, they will still flock to him. And that's not necessarily a safe calculation. All he really needs is a few defections, and he might be done, because if you recall, he only won the presidential election against Hillary Clinton by about 50,000 votes in 3 states. She won the popular vote. So, I mean, it's a dangerous calculation. However, I mean, it is something that he feels that it has paid off for him in the past. And again, he does not trust multilateral regimes like the WTO. He will make up facts and figures, and indeed, he might even be, in his mind, using, say, the intellectual property issue as kind of the gravitas, the kind of complex issue that he can point to, where some of his motivations might be utterly more base than that. So, you know, we just don't know, and in Washington, that is the problem now. There are even his Republican allies in Congress will say, and I've talked to some of them yesterday, they just don't know. Some of them just don't know what he's trying to do.
Mr. Blackburn-Dwyer, Professor Trump has been talking about what China has to do to unilaterally reduce the trade gap by $100 billion US, otherwise blah, blah, blah. Can a trade deficit or trade gap be reduced in such a manner by one country unilaterally?
No. I mean, the only way that you could potentially do that is to legitimately just stop buying or forbid the importation of a huge chunk of goods. But as one of my colleagues pointed out, the calculations are wrong. The United States says it's 375 billion, but that's a really classic way of calculating it. If you look at value add, the iPhone, for example, and the classic thing, cost the United States as an import good $400. If you go with value add and take into account the fact that there's a lot of products made in other countries that are then sent to China and assembled in China, each iPhone only hits the import by about $7. That's a massive difference. So the reality is Trump's goal is unrealistic. His rhetoric is something out of either the 1930s or at most generous the 1990s and the early trade war of 1994. Trade is much more complicated, it's much more globalized, it includes a number of different countries. It is a multilateral activity regardless of Trump's distaste and obvious distaste for organizations like the WTO. The reality is this is a failed effort. It's never going to work. He's never going to get that, and frankly, he'll just change the story. Because in his mind, as a friend of mine always says, facts fade, stories stick. And President Trump has been brilliant at that. He will make up whatever facts he wants, he'll weave it into a narrative that his base eats up, and then all they'll remember is the story. They'll never go back and care about the facts, and even if people point out that they're wrong, they just don't care.
Well, you can do that as a private merchant, as a private businessman, right? But as leader of, or as president of the most powerful country in the world, there is a slight problem there. Professor Reifowitz, China has called on the United States to sit down and talk about these issues, but China has demanded mutual respect from the United States in handling these issues with China. Do you think China might get any of that from the Trump administration?
I wouldn't be surprised if, in the end, some kind of deal was cut. I don't want to be naively optimistic here, but this is really about money in the end. And while Trump needs to be able to declare some kind of victory, he has to have some kind of victory to declare. He has to be able to show some kind of economic results. And if things are worse off for the United States economy because of various trade disputes, worse off than they would have been had he done nothing, then he might be able to go back to his base, but his base is not enough to re-elect him. He needs to do more than hold on to the base that he had last time. Democrats have done very well in recent elections. There was another one just last night in Wisconsin, which is a state that Trump won, but that had been a Democratic state, where a liberal judge won an election to the state Supreme Court and moved a seat that had been conservative into the liberal side. Judicial elections are a little more complicated, but it's still basically another sign that Trump is in trouble politically. So he's got to come out of this with some kind of real victory. Yeah, maybe there are 30–35% of the people who will believe that a loss is a victory, but there's another 20 to 25% in the middle that he's got to get a decent chunk of in order to get anywhere near enough to be able to win re-election, or for his party to hold houses of Congress that they currently hold. I don't know that it's going to happen. I think in the end he might be able to take half a loaf or even a quarter of a loaf or some kind of loaf. It's in the interest of both sides to come to some kind of agreement. So I suspect that in the end, China and the president will find some way for both sides to back down from this. At least that's what I hope.
That is our hope as well. Zhao Hai, at this moment, from the joint press conference we heard earlier today of the Ministry of Finance and the Ministry of Commerce, do you get the idea that some kind of negotiation is going on? Because I didn't get any sign that some kind of negotiation is going on. China said they welcome whenever the U.S. is ready to talk.
I think, well, at this moment, publicly, I don't think there's a negotiation that we know of. However, we've seen that China has tried. Vice Premier Liu He has visited right before this 301 investigation results was declared, and China has continued to call on U.S. to respond to China's request for further negotiations. So I think moving forward, there's only one way out, that is cooperation and negotiation. The trade war will harm everyone, and there's no winner.
Professor Chambers, do you think there are some chances that before the two sides really hit each other with these lists going into actual effect, some kind of deal could be cut between the two sides?
Well, I don't rule it out. I think it's going to be a very tough situation, and I think the Chinese are going to have to go into it knowing that a lot of it is political theater on the president's part, and try to basically keep that noise out of negotiations. However, you know, again, does China want to be dragged into bilateral negotiations, ignoring multilateral agencies like the WTO every time the president has a tantrum? That's the thing. I mean, you know, that's a calculation that the Chinese are going to have to make too. You know, and so I really don't know at this point.
Yeah, the situation will continue to develop, and we'll be talking about this for the next foreseeable period of time. Many thanks to my three guests: Zhao Hai from the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, Professor Christopher Chambers from Georgetown University, Brandon Blackburn-Dwyer, founder of Grasshopper Strategies, and Professor Ian Reifowitz of SUNY-Empire State College. And here's my point. President Trump has a record of getting his facts wrong. He wants to make China reduce its trade deficit, which, according to him, stands at $500 billion US dollars annually. Well, in February, the U.S. Commerce Department put U.S.-China trade deficit for 2017 at $375 billion US dollars. It was a record high, so no way an annual average could be $500 billion US dollars. We don't know where he got his number. Now, Chinese officials have a point in calling his policies willful and impulsive. Now, President Trump probably believes that by exerting pressure on China, he will make China blink and back down. I believe that is a poor bet. China's response has been measured and defensive, but the messages from different departments have been coherent. If you want to talk, we're ready, but if you want a trade war, we're ready too. Every step President Trump takes will be met with an equally intensive response from China. A step in the wrong direction would be met with retaliation. A step in the right direction, however, would be greatly welcomed. It's his call. That is it for this edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin. As always, follow me on Facebook and Twitter using the handle The Point with Alex. Download the application called CGTN to watch the show on your mobile devices, or go to YouTube and look for CGTN The Point. Thanks for watching. You've got The Point.